Hello, BookTube. Well, welcome to week 2 of Sagalong. That's a reading event that was organized by Elena Makridina and is now joined by a whole bunch of other great booktubers. I'll leave a link down below to everybody who's doing these videos where we explore the world of the Icelandic sagas. A wonderful cornucopia of fascinating stuff as a literary tradition. And we're doing it one saga at a time. So there's plenty more room for sagalongs in following years. And this week's saga is Gunnlaug the Wormtongue. It's not quite as short a saga as we did last time. Last time we did the Saga of Eric the Red, which is only a couple dozen pages. This is a slightly bit longer, but still a very simple story about about a teenager. About a teenager named Gunnlaug who has a virtuous brother, he has an imperious father, and he himself is feckless. The word is never used. We're supposed to take him seriously, and a lot of people do in the course of the saga, but he is impatient for his future. He's like most teenage boys. He's impatient for his future. He's impatient to be taken seriously. He's impatient even at cross purposes to his other impatiences. So, as is pointed out in the saga, he falls in love with the most beautiful woman in the country, who has a conflicted story of her own that we get first. Why? I don't know. Certainly, there are ways in which the Icelandic sagas defy what has come to be called the standard Western narrative tradition. In this saga, for instance, although the saga author, when having Gunnlaug or anybody else interact with somebody, when they're done with that somebody, very often the author of this saga, which I read in Gwyn Jones's translation for Oxford, very often when those interactions are done, the author of this saga will say, and then so-and-so left, and that's the last we hear of him. So you don't have to worry about that character. You're never going to hear from them again. The author of the saga doesn't do that all the time. There are plenty of characters you don't need to worry about you're not told that about. But at one point, Gunnlaug falls in love with this beautiful young woman and wants to marry her. And her father thinks that he is not serious, that he's not a serious suitor, and maybe not worthy, which causes hot words between them. Because keep in mind, this is a warrior culture in which honor means a lot. So you can tell a suitor, I don't think you're wealthy enough. I'm looking out for my daughter's comfort. But you really can't tell a suitor, I don't think you're good enough. that starts to get you into blood vendetta territory. But at the same time, Gunnlaug also tells his father that he wants to be fitted out for a sea voyage and make his name as a sea voyager, as a Viking. And his father doesn't believe him either, says, I don't think you're serious about this at all. It actually catches him trying to fit out his own ship and drags the bags of stores back into the barn. Says, you don't go without my permission, and I haven't given it to you yet. And in both cases, the men involved point out to Gunnlaug that, which is it that you want? One minute you're saying you want to marry this young woman, the next minute you're saying you want to ship out to sea. Those two things don't go together, and who knows what you really want. And that emphasized for me something that I noticed this time around when I was reading this thing, which is that there are almost no secrets in this claustrophobic little world of fjords and farms and mountain estates. Almost everywhere that you go in this little saga, everybody already knows everything. It's uncanny. The story of the beautiful girl's she has a very unusual childhood, to put it mildly. The first 6 years of her life are very unusual. And you read that story, which was the unusual qualities of her childhood were designed to be secret by her mother. And yet, in the course of the saga, everybody knows about them. And everybody knows Gunnlaug's business, when we don't know how they do. Everybody knows the backstory to everything else, which is fascinating. It should sap the drama, but it doesn't. Instead, it throws the emphasis back on how truthful all of the characters are being about anything. And that's fascinating. The sobriquet here, Wormtongue, is, I think, misplaced. It comes from two facts, really, that Gunnlaug, in addition to being a handy warrior, is also a skald. He's a poet, including an element of skaldic poetry that perhaps has made a comeback now that maybe the people in the Victorian era didn't quite think about was this extemporaneous element. We think about Eminem in 8 Mile. Think about not knowing what you're going to make a poem about until the circumstance is right in front of you, and then it has to be not only technically right, but also good. Gunnlaug is good at that, but whether he's delivering a sharp poem to someone and angering them, or whether he's just talking with them about what he wants and doesn't want and what he thinks is his due, in both cases, his words are very sharp. They're not diplomatic at all. And, that brings me to a frustration that I had this time around that I didn't have with Eric the Red, probably because it was so short. The frustration with the translator, for the first time ever. This is always what I talk about when I talk about literature and translation. Do you feel like the translator is in the room with you, bumping into furniture and making themselves known? Do they draw attention to themselves? They're not supposed to, but do they? And if they do, then that means you can't trust them. And this, for the first time, Gwyn Jones really did, all throughout the course of this saga. We get mid-20th century Britishisms. We're told that something is a rumpus, for instance. Not a word that I think the original poet here would have used, or even alluded, not even a synonym. And a whole bunch of other things. Little things, the way characters talk to each other that sound like something I don't even know, out of an Anthony Poole novel. They don't sound, it doesn't sound right. I was willing to turn a deaf ear to that, except that, why even call it this? Why call it Gunnlaug Wormtongue? Wormtongue can't help but connote with a lot of readers to Lord of the Rings, to Grima Wormtongue, to the corrupt and corrupting counselor of King Theoden. And Tolkien, of course, knew the Icelandic sagas backwards and forwards, and probably he encountered a variation on that name here, and it just stuck with him as a really good one. But it doesn't work in this saga, and one of the ways that you can tell that is because Gwyn Jones himself doesn't use it. When he describes his own character's sobriquet, he uses what I think is a much better translation, which is snake tongue. Dangerous. Poisonous. Not worm tongue. There's nothing wormish or unworthy or cowardly or small or cringing about Gunnlaug. So it was translation issues all throughout that really got to me with this one. It really bothered me. The characters kept talking like they just walked out of a Kingsley Amis novel and were putting on Viking dress, and that bugged me. It put a distance between this and me that I would like to correct. I checked when I was done reading Gunnlaug Wormtongue, and this is the only translation that I have. So I'm going to have to deal with it for now. But I think the next one that we do, I believe, is King Harold Saga, and I will be reading as many translations as I can find for that. In fact, that will be another occasion where I go to the Boston Public Library, start to use the Boston Public Library. But one other thing that I wanted to note about this saga, it's very good reading. It's very different from Eric the Red. So if you're using Sagalong to maybe give you an idea of whether or not you want to read these things yourself, you might want to skip Eric the Red and start with something like Gunnlaug, because it's shorter and because it has a relatively cohesive narrative point. Gunnlaug has a rival for the most beautiful woman in the country, and that rivalry starts to mean more to him than she does. And also we get something of his travels, which is fascinating in its own right. He goes to various kingdoms. He meets various kings, and he tells them all the same thing. I have a verse I would like to sing for you. Will you hear it? And one of the interesting things about that is that it's where nuts and bolts real history comes sliding into the Icelandic sagas. Because when he goes to England, he meets King Ethelred. And we hear all about King Canute the Great, and about King Svein, Forkbeard. And it's interesting that King Ethelred, when presented with, I've got a poem, would you like to hear it, isn't discourteous. He isn't dismissive. He isn't judgmental at all. He's not rude. And that's interesting because Gunnlaug doesn't always get that reaction from kings. And Ethelred is also a practiced king. One of the kings that Gunnlaug goes to is so impressed. He's new to his kingship, and he's so blown away that he says, well, how about if I give you a couple of merchant ships? And his own men have to tell him, probably that's too much. Why don't you give him a cape instead? Well, I thought that was fascinating because at the point when Gunnlaug goes to Ethelred's court in England, we're told that there was no language barrier. Unlike what would obtain only a little bit later when William of Normandy came over and conquered England, and all of a sudden the language became French, which tells you not only that there was a kind of one world atmosphere between Norway and Iceland and Denmark and England, and all of these places sort of knew how to talk with each other, quite literally. It also tells you that this is being composed in hindsight, not only because in this, as in so many other sagas, the writer of the saga talks about the most important event that has ever occurred, the conversion of the country to Christianity. In other words, that has long since happened. And even though these stories are sometimes set when it hasn't happened yet, or when it's in the process of happening, not only that, but also the writer of this saga knows already about the Norman conquest. Knows already about, he's setting this in the time of King Ethelred. But he himself is not in the time of King Ethelred. I thought that was fascinating. Those are the sorts of little things that historians of, for instance, the English monarchy and biographers of the English kings, there was just recently one of Ethelred, it's the sort of thing that they go for. They go hunting through stuff like these sagas to find little details like that and see how they line up with documented history. I just think that's fascinating. so that's Gunnlaug Wormtongue. I don't like, for the first time in Sagalong, I'm hoping it doesn't keep happening. I don't like the reading experience that I had, and it wasn't the saga writers, it wasn't the Skald's fault, it was the translator's fault. And it maybe wasn't even the translator's fault. Probably Gwyn Jones was doing a fine job by the standards of, the late 1950s, early 1960s, or whenever he wrote. I mean, there are competing schools of translation. Do you use the idiom of your day? Do you try to make it immediately sound immediately right to the ear of the contemporaneous reader? If you do, you maximize your chances that those readers will actually read the work and not be intimidated by it. But you also maximize the chances that your work will date. And if that was Gwyn Jones' calculation 70 years ago, it certainly bore out, because this felt dated to me. The translation took me out of the saga on many different points. So I'll be reading around for the next one. It just makes me kick myself a little that I don't know how to read these things in the original. Anyway, that is Sagalong Week 2. Everybody else is making videos. They're all doing fancy schmancy thumbnails. I can't do fancy schmancy thumbnails, but you're gonna love these videos. This is exactly the kind of thing that I was hoping would happen more often in 2019, where BookTube would just sort of start playing with each other, start doing things together. This is exactly the sort of thing is so much fun, and we're moving on. We still have 2 more sagas to go, and for random chance or planning, one way or the other, the sagas get increasingly more complex as we go along. So the next one is I think, far more ambitious than Gunnlaug, which is essentially a hot-tempered love story that ends in a massive melee. That has the melee that it ends with has some macabre, funny bits. I mentioned that the Icelandic sense of humor, the Viking sense of humor, sometimes crops up in these things, and it's delightful. And there is a bit of wordplay that happens at the climax of that fight, and Gwyn Jones blows it, just completely blows it, in a way that I am certain the original poet did not. It's just... Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. We have plenty of other things to talk about. Thank you, BookTube.